welcome you tonight to our last Mound seminar of 2019. We don't do this in December, right? So Sue's going to be our grand finale for the year, and but we will be having the next one in January, the 4th Wednesday. I think it's the 25th. I don't have a calendar in front of me. We're going to have Jack Black talk about SpaceX. So if you're interested in the perspective of what SpaceX is doing, that will be in January. But now it is my pleasure to introduce Sue Smiley, who had roots here at Mound, very deep. In fact, like second generation or so.
Yep, moved here in '63 when my dad got a job here.
So, but she's going to talk about the DOE legacy management programs in Mound and Fernald, and she's a site manager for DOE
for both of those.
For both of those. So, thank you.
All right.
Welcome, Sue.
Thanks, Bob. And I apologize, I did not change my cover slide. I just gave this presentation at Miami University a couple weeks ago, so I apologize for that. Penny's going to move the slides so that I can do the pointer and occasionally look at cheat sheets. Okay, so the purpose of this presentation tonight, I wanted to answer some questions. First of all, for you to understand what the Department of Energy Office of Legacy Management, or LM, is all about, and kind of do a compare and contrast of the Mound and Fernald sites in Ohio. So during production era, during environmental cleanup, and what's happening at the sites today. And then some of the things, some of the path forward that we still need to accomplish at both of those sites. Next slide. Thank you, Ms. Farmer. Go back. So the Office of Legacy Management, in 2003, Congress mandated the Department of Energy to provide a long-term sustainable solution because there was the Office of Environmental Management that had been going like gangbusters to clean up sites, but there hadn't been a lot of thought as to, well, what are we going to do when the bulk of the cleanup is done and EM moves on to another site that needs cleanup? So Legacy Management was established in 2003. We'll go ahead to the next slide. Like every organization, we have a strategic plan. Ours is actually being rewritten right now, but the current draft, if you were to look at that on the public website, has 6 goals. The 4 that I highlighted I felt are kind of most germane to tonight's discussion. So obviously, protect human health and the environment. A big part of what we do is to preserve and protect and share records and information, and that is so future generations never forget about the site's contributions to the Cold War, what the environmental cleanup entailed, and what present-day activities are going on. Sustainably manage and optimize the use of land and assets. I'll tell you now that Fernald and Mound are, they get gold stars in the Department of Energy when it comes to demonstrating beneficial use of the site. It's a use that's in the best interest of the community. And goal 6, engage public, governments, interested parties. That's why I'm here tonight. I'm accompanied by Penny Workman. Penny, wave. Penny works for Navarro Research and Engineering, which is the contractor to the Department of Energy, LM. So for example, I work at Fernald with one other federal employee, and there's almost 40 Navarro people at Fernald that support that site, Mound site, and other sites on the East Coast. We just accepted the 100th site in our portfolio. Now, the only reason I throw this up here, obviously you can't read it, but the little colored triangles and circles and squares represent the different types of sites that we have. So you've got Superfund sites like Mound and Fernald, or you might have UNTRCA, Uranium Mill Tailings Remediation Control Act. I think that's what that stands for. FUSRAP, formerly utilized sites. And this just gives you a feel for how much they're spread across the United States. We also have a site in Alaska and one in Puerto Rico. I always get the question, how many sites are in the state of Ohio? Well, the answer is 11. So Mound and Fernald are 2. One of the nearer sites that you may also be familiar with is in Piqua. There is a reactor. But if you go onto the public website for LM, there's a sites tab, and you can drill down to the state of Ohio, and you can pull up these 1- to 2-page fact sheets on all of these sites. It's a very interesting read. So similarities during operations for the two sites. They were both built after World War II to support nuclear weapons production during the Cold War. Both highly secure, fenced, had a guard force, handled classified materials, products, documents. You needed a Q security clearance. And everything was on a need-to-know basis. So your best friend may be working in a building beside you, but you wouldn't necessarily know what your best friend works on a day-to-day basis. And that last bullet is very true. I worked at Mound. I started working here in 1990, and it was a few years before I knew there was a site an hour from here called Fernald. And I find that with Fernald people as well. They had not heard of the Mound site an hour away. So some of the differences during operations. Mound operated from 48 to 2003. It's 306 acres smack dab in the middle of downtown Miamisburg. It was built to continue polonium work that was initially performed in Dayton, Ohio as part of the Manhattan Project. And then later the mission here expanded to research, development, production for U.S. weapons, energy programs. I have a later slide with a little more information on the various missions. Fernald operated from 51 to 89. It's over 1,000 acres, purely rural setting. And it was a foundry. It was a uranium foundry. There were processes to purify the uranium and then other processes in another part of the plant to machine that metal to various shapes. These are just aerial photos. On the left, that's Mound. So I just wanted to point out, so here's the Great Miami River. The purple is the Mound site. Here's Fernald, and in this photo, this is the Great Miami River. So both sites actually are over the same aquifer. It's called the Great Miami River Buried Valley Aquifer. So during peak operations, there were about 2,500 people that worked here. I remember, sometimes you got the last spot in the lower parking lot. Now, what I don't know about Mound is if there were multiple shifts run here. Were there multiple shifts?
Occasionally, I think. I don't think it was a standard, but I
Okay.
think there were occasional periods.
Okay. Okay. So 2,500 at the peak, which I believe is about 1988. This is a shot of Fernald, which at its peak had 3,000 employees, and they were running 24/7. So that would have been 3 shifts. So back in the 1970s is when the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency was formed. Recall that the Earth Day, the very first one, was in 1970, and then Ohio EPA was formed a couple years after U.S. EPA. Congress passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA, also known as Superfund, in 1980. And what the U.S. EPA did was they had the Superfund National Priority List. So both Mound and Fernald were put on that NPL list. And what that did is it gave EPA the authority to, if you can find the responsible party who contaminated the site, then they can clean it up. There's a huge public involvement process in CERCLA. And a neat thing about the CERCLA or Superfund is that you clean up sites to a beneficial reuse. So some kind of end state that the local community and the stakeholders agree makes sense for the site. In Mound's case, it was cleaned to an industrial commercial end state. It was already a commercial industrial land use. Fernald, it was cleaned up to a similar land use, but it was a recreational land use because that is a portion of that site is open to the public, hiking trails. It's an undeveloped park. Again, comparing and contrasting, both sites were put on the NPL in 1989 for different reasons. Mound was put on there because of volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, that had made their way into the groundwater. Though those are a very common contaminant in groundwater. They're like degreasing agents that are used at auto body shops, machine shops. Fernald was put on the NPL because of both chemical and radiological contamination in soil, groundwater, surface water. Fernald stopped production in '89. We ceased operations in 2003, maybe 2002. I know that the RTGs left after the 9/11 attacks, and that was 2001, so I think they moved to Idaho, RTGs, in 2002. So here, various photos that some of you will recognize. That's the Berlin Wall being built. We got Castro, Khrushchev, and Kennedy, and the Russian missiles. So in 1989, this is when big change started to happen. So the Berlin Wall fell, and of course that was the beginning of the end for the communist regimes. And eventually the Cold War came to an end, which triggered nuclear arms reduction. So in 1992, the Department of Energy did, they called it a reconfiguration study, and they looked at all the sites across the United States and figured out what missions could be consolidated in certain sites. And what that meant, Mound was going to close, Fernald was going to close too. Now that would be the nuclear weapons production aspect mission. At Mound there was another big mission happening, and that was the radioisotope thermoelectric generator program that helped with space exploration. So that hung around a lot longer, and I think would have stayed longer if it had not been for 9/11 that made it move to Idaho. These are just photos of some former astronauts that were here in 2000, because I think it was Pioneer, Galileo, Voyager. There are still some RTGs, are there not, that are powering. Which ones is it? Voyager?
Voyager.
The Voyager probes are still out there. I mean, it's 40 plus years, and they're still running on a plutonium-238 battery, if you will, that was made here at Mound. Similarities of cleanup. So again, I mentioned they were both cleaned up by the DOE Office of Environmental Management under CERCLA, or Superfund. Both sites worked closely with US EPA and Ohio EPA during and after cleanup. Still work with them today. Worked very closely with stakeholder groups, and that was to help determine what the appropriate cleanup levels ought to be and the associated end states that you're trying to clean up to. Both sites located over the sole source aquifer. That's a huge aquifer, millions and millions of acres. It extends even north of Piqua. Mound was expensive to clean up. It was $1 billion to clean up at Mound, but when you compare it to the Fernald price tag of $4.4 billion, it was pretty cost-effective done here for very different reasons, the cost differences. So in terms of the Mound cleanup, the end state was beneficial to use as an industrial commercial park, and the federal property would be transferred to private ownership. In comparison at Fernald, the end state there is an undeveloped park with an emphasis on wildlife. So undeveloped simply means it's not like a park where you're going to have beautiful concrete bathrooms outside, paved trails, a dog park, things like that. It also needed to have an educational center, which is today's visitor center there, so that people can tour the exhibits, learn about the site, take advantage of interpretive services programs such as Penny and her staff provide. And with that site, it will remain under federal ownership. To compare the environmental remedies at Mound, we have groundwater monitoring, pump and treat, currently on standby while we're running a field demonstration of a different technology, and we have institutional controls. So ICs are their land use controls that run with the land. So they're, for example, included in a deed restriction or an environmental covenant that would be recorded at the county. We also, some of you may recall, we had what's considered basically a non-CERCLA excavation of the OE-1 landfill. That was completed in, I think, about 2010 when that was finally completed. But what that did, in 1995, that area called Operable Unit 1, which was VOC contamination of the groundwater, it had an engineered disposal facility. Well, the department cleaned it up. We had a CERCLA record of decision, but the one thing that ROD required, it had a no-dig restriction. So there would need to be a fence around the landfill, and nobody could touch that area. Well, the Mound Development Corporation, which is the entity that manages this site, and the city of Myronspur didn't like that for understandable reasons. It was kind of a blight on the property. They wanted it removed, and they worked and lobbied, and funding came up, and that landfill was removed. did not change the groundwater remedy at all, but it removed the landfill and thus that restriction of you can't dig here. At Fernald, we built an on-site disposal cell. About 85% of the waste that was generated at Fernald went in that disposal cell. That's basically contaminated soils and demolition debris. The other 15% approximately was shipped to off-site licensed facilities. And it was also a very similar split in terms of the, the volume, the kind of the 85-15 split, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the 85% volume was the least, help me, what
That represented about 1/4 of the risk.
Oh, okay.
And the 15% represented 3/4 of the risk.
Right, okay. At Fernald, there is a huge groundwater pump and treat going on there. It's nothing like the tiny little pump and treat that's been happening at Mound for the past several years. There are also institutional controls at Fernald. They're a little less complex and easier to monitor. One, that site is going to remain under federal ownership. And so it's a lot easier to make sure that nobody's out there sinking a well or digging a hole or grazing cattle, for example. Next slide. Okay, so now we'll just get into Mound. This is a photo of some of our groundwater sampling crew that comes out. That happens quarterly and semi-annually, depending on what they're monitoring for. These folks come from the Fernald facility and travel up here to do that monitoring. So mission during operations, as I said, weapons components, development, and surveillance. We had tritium recovery because tritium is really expensive, so it would be recovered from the reservoir so they could be used for other purposes like exit signs. Stable isotopes, the energetic materials, detonators, timers development. I think that was kind of the area my dad worked in. Of course, I never really knew what my dad did. The RTG program, which supported NASA. And calorimetry research and development. And calorimetry, and I know one of you guys will correct me, is it's a way to measure heat, and so that was used to quantify the amount of radioactive material or something?
Yeah, one of the things you do calorimetry is quantify how much radioactivity you have by knowing that, so you can measure that and do that. But it's also used to measure reactions and other things, but it's a general technique, but by monitoring heat.
Okay, monitoring heat, all right. So again at Mound, the DOE, EPA, and Ohio EPA signed a tripartite federal facility agreement in 1993, and as part of that they formed what's called the Mound Core Team. That would be where all remediation decisions and even present day activities would be reviewed by the Core Team. We do meet every 2 months, the Core Team here at the Mound site. In 1995, they came up with this thing called Mound 2000 approach that really made sense for Mound. Because you had a bunch of contamination that was kind of in spits and spurts all over the site versus gigantic areas of contamination like you had at Fernald, you could draw a nice boundary around. So at Mound they used what's called the CERCLA Removal Action Authority so that they could go target those discrete areas of contamination, which allowed DOE more quickly to turn over remediated properties to the Mound Development Corporation. Stakeholders, huge part of the decision-making process. These happen to be photos of Mound Reuse Committee meetings. There was also a citizens group called Miamisburg Environmental Safety and Health, very, very active during cleanup. So when the decision was made to move Mound, to close it, the city created the Mound Community Improvement Corporation, which was a nonprofit arm of the city that would be responsible for managing this business park. And they worked very closely with the Department of Energy as properties were cleaned up. The Department of Energy would transfer them to MMCIC via lease, and then MMCIC would turn around and lease into other parties. And part of the goal of the MMCIC was to sort of redirect what had been functions, facilities, people skills that had been supporting the Cold War and take those same skills and products and do that same work in the private sector. In 1998, DOE sold the entire site to MMCIC for $10 because federal government can't just give an asset away, so we had to come up with a price tag. But that's good because that means the MMCIC didn't have to come in with some huge debt in order to manage this reuse, this industrial park. The city also did a very smart thing. They chartered a Mound Reuse Committee to be an independent advisory organization. That thing ran for 16 years for the duration of the cleanup. And it was a vehicle to provide public input on cleanup and reuse. And it was a really good cross-section of people. I believe there was a representative from the MESH, the Citizens Action Group. You had city council members, school superintendent, local bank presidents, and I think there was one employee from the DOE contractor also on that, as well as the EPA. So one of the things when the mission ended, we had to, before we could start tearing down buildings, we had to do safe shutdown. So that simply means you remove furniture that's in there, records, product. You have to get all of that out of the buildings before you can start tearing them down. So these are just some photos of boxing all that stuff up to get it out of various buildings. The environmental restoration program actually began in 1992, and it was following the CERCLA requirements. And it was during that same time in about 1993 when DOE, the regulators in the city all agreed that we were going to clean this site up to CERCLA standards for an industrial or commercial use. That top photo there is A building, which is the first building that was built here, and that was when it started to be torn down. And this bottom photo was in 2010 after all of the buildings that needed to be demolished were demolished. So you can see over there the stats on the left, how many buildings or structures were taken down. Prepared 23 buildings for industrial reuse. Those were the things that went down to the CIC. They subsequently demolished some of those structures they felt that they didn't need. And we evaluated over 442 potential release sites. That goes back to that Mound 2000 process. We had looked at these 442 areas across the site, and we ended up remediating about 190 of those. And the entire site, 306 acres, was cleaned to industrial commercial use. These are more safe shutdown photos. I believe they're all in T building. Like on the lower left, a lot of work had to be done with ventilation controls. For a while, we were storing transuranic waste in T building. That's what's in the barrels. And I believe that's a photo on the first floor where they were packaging up tree waste and pulling it up to the second floor where it could be loaded on semis so it could be hauled away to an off-site disposal facility. Some more pictures of cleanup. We got stacks, a smokestack, well not a smokestack, needed to be cleaned up. You need to do that under a negative pressure environment. And they would start at the top of these stacks and kind of work inside. Upper right, it's hard to see, but there's water being misted while demolition is happening, and that's to control fugitive dust. State law requires that you try to keep dust emissions down. And those are simply before and after photos at the bottom of the RSW building. This is a T building, which had a whole lot of glove boxes before and after. So that was, you can imagine T building was the very last building that the Mound Development Corporation was able to find a buyer for. They finally sold it last year. So it had been vacant for 20 years. And you can see by the photo as to why it was very difficult to market that facility. Potential release site 66 was just an example of a very, very large, I think it was a $32 million excavation. It was just a ravine where over years construction rubble or empty drums would be put down in the ravine, dirt was thrown over, and it was a parking lot for many years. But it was a dump. It needed to be cleaned up. These are just photos, as it says, through the year. So the 1988, that's the photo I showed you before when there were about 2,500 employees. And that is the entrance to the main site off of Mound Road. So the Mound Business Park is managed by the Mound Development Corporation. Over 95% of the site no longer is owned by the Department of Energy. And MDC, we would transfer title to MDC, but a lot of those properties, they would turn around and sell to third parties. Other property they've held on to and they've leased to third parties. There's a very small area, it's that Operable Unit, the Operable Unit 1 area of the site that the Department of Energy still owns, and we may be transferring title of that to another third party at some time. So our oversight responsibilities that we have is to manage all the CERCLA remedies, and once a year we do an annual site walk down with the regulators, the NDC and the City of Miamisburg, to assess the effectiveness of our institutional controls. We assess the effectiveness all the time throughout the year, but once a year we have these annual site walk downs where you're looking to see, okay, has anybody put in a well? Has anybody been excavating soil? We also go through T-building because there are some institutional controls specific to T-building. We are still doing groundwater remediation. We maintain records, make them available to the public, and as I said, there's no federal presence at Mound. We are monitoring the groundwater for the VOCs and or tridding, depending on the area of site you're talking about. We have monitoring wells, and there are some naturally occurring seeps that we also monitor when there's a sufficient amount of water coming out of the ground to collect a sample. Report the results to the regulators, and we produce an annual groundwater monitoring report that we put on the CERCLA administrative record for the public to have access to. The institutional controls are listed there. You'll notice the little footnote at the bottom. If a property owner thinks they might want to deviate from an institutional control, they have to ask the regulator's permission. To date, there have been no requests for deviation, although a couple days ago I did get the very first request, and we're going to start taking a look at that in court team. So you can't remove soil from the 306 acres. You can move it around wherever you want to. You just can't remove it. You can't use groundwater for any purpose. And as I said, in T-building, there are some additional institutional controls. You can't penetrate or remove flooring in certain areas without the regulator's permission. Part of the annual walkthrough that we do, we're doing not only the physical inspections, we review a lot of public records, Montgomery County real estate records. We go to the City of Miamisburg and look at their permit applications. And we talk at least once a year with property owners here. We go over the ICs, make sure they understand them, ask them, hey, do you have any questions? And that has proven to be a very effective method, and we publish this annual report on the effectiveness of ICs. This is one a couple of years, 2017. This again, that's at the entrance to T-building there on the left, and here we are inside that room. I believe this is the last Mound slide. A really neat thing about Mound in terms of the institutional controls is that there are multiple levels of ICs. So the CERCLA records of decision, that is the legal driver for the institutional controls, or in the case of Parcel 9, there is also an environmental covenant. When the NDC, when they sublease property to business park people, they verbatim put those ICs inside the subleases. Same goes when DOE would issue a quitclaim deed to MDC. MDC also has what are called limited warranty deeds. So if they're not leasing property, they're selling property, they do what's called limited warranty deeds. City permits, I'm working right now with the city permits folks so that when applicants who want to perform road work or excavation work on the Mound site, there's a question on the application that says, is this where you're going to be performing work? Yes or no? And if it's yes, there's a listing of the ICs. And, you know, if you don't understand what these mean, call me. MDC also manages a soil staging and borrow area. Again, that's because you can't remove soil from the site, but you can move it wherever you want to. So they do that as a convenience for the business park tenants. And the city just passed a special zoning district for the Mound Business Park. I believe that was in January when that passed, and we are starting the rezoning process right now. That also lists the CERCLA institutional controls. So moving forward, we're going to keep on groundwater monitoring, reporting until drinking water standards are met. The entire site will eventually be privately owned. We're going to have to continue educating new and current property owners on ICs, and continue to interact with the public, stakeholders, elected officials, etc. And it is a little bit of a challenge sometimes to manage a site with no on-site presence. I can't look out my office window and see what's going on here like I used to be able to do 15 years ago. Last slide. This is just an example of the end use here is a commercial industrial park. It's not a recreational park. It's not a City of Miamisburg community park. So like there's a sign, I think the one on the left says recreational use prohibited, I believe. Occasionally I would see some kids parking their fishing poles against that sign. Now there are some no trespassing signs. It's really just that's trespass. If MMC or Mound Development Corporation saw somebody out there with fishing, they could certainly come out there and say, don't fish, this is an industrial park, it's not a community park. I just got a kick out of the kids. It's easier to put up a sign that says no fishing than one that says recreational use prohibited. It took about 15 years for that to click. Okay, so this is Fernald. The big photo there, we had a huge thing, I think this was 2 years ago, called Envirothon, and that was high school kids at a regional level that were coming and doing all kinds of competitions. There's the entrance to the site, that big rock. Whoops, trying to forward, go ahead, Penny. So again, that's the photo showing what it was like when the Department of Energy, or AEC, actually took that land by eminent domain, 1,050 acres. Production 51 to 89, so they converted uranium ore in concentrates into a high purity product through chemical and metallurgical processes, and then they would machine that product to various shapes depending on where they were going to. So some of them went to Hanford, Washington, Savannah River, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Very expensive annual budget, $70 million. And a big problem at Fernald was for every pound of product that was produced, they were producing 3 pounds of waste. So these are just some examples of the machining that was involved to specific standards. Some of these things are called targets. They're like tubes that were put in reactors at Savannah River and Hanford as part of nuclear weapons production. This is Drum Mountain. Everything came to Fernald in drums, was stored in drums, and was shipped off-site in drums. So when the drums were no longer usable, they were smashed and thrown in a big heap. So this would have been, I don't know, the 1940s era photo here. Oops, that's okay. Let me see. Is that the right one or did we? Yeah, okay. So that was the photo I showed you earlier. So that's just an example. That is a very small section of the production area. And those are barrels, some of which had some product in that we had to get rid of, rusted metal boxes. It was a very different facility than the Mound facility when we first started the cleanup. So this would have been in the 80s. Fernald was a poster child. We were getting national attention for the level of contamination at the property and just the scope of the cleanup that would be required. There were all kinds of TV programs and investigative reporters going on. So at Fernald, unlike Mound, instead of doing the little removal action authority where you go after little pieces of contamination, they did a 10-year remedial investigation and feasibility study. Remedial investigation is when you're trying to determine the nature and extent of contamination. What contaminants are out there? Are they in the ground, the water, the air, and at what levels? And then the next step is you do a feasibility study where you say, okay, this is what we have to clean up. What technologies are available to clean up those contaminants? They identified 5 operable units, or OUs, where a CERCLA record of decision would define the remedy. So like there was, one of the OUs was the production area, another was the waste pits. And in each rod, final remediation levels are chosen for each contaminant, and that's based on what you have to clean a contaminant up to such that it's protective of this undeveloped park land use. As we mentioned earlier, the on-site disposal facility was where about 85% of the environmental cleanup debris went to. huge community involvement at Fernald. They were involved in the decision on what would be the future use, cleanup levels, and this balanced approach to waste disposition. This is something a citizens group, fresh Fernald residents for environmental safety and health, they're very proud of. They did not want to be known as the site that shipped all their waste to somebody else's backyard. So they made the decision, this balanced approach meant that they wanted to have an on-site disposal facility so that the bulk of their waste would remain on site. Go back one photo. We had tons and tons of public meetings, hundreds of them. The one in the middle was kind of interesting. It was, I think they called it Cleanopoly as opposed to Monopoly, but it was a way for members of the public to come, and there were these different colored tokens, and they would try to figure out, based on the type of waste, the quantity of waste, the cost to remediate. It was a way to visualize how hard it was to define the scope of this cleanup. So Operable Unit 1, that was an area known as the waste pit, so it was the largest waste shipping campaign in DOE history at the time. You can see how many tons that we did have to ship off-site. All of that waste had to be dried, and it took 6 years to get it all shipped off-site. Operable Unit 2 was kind of a mishmash of contaminated areas across the site. You can see there in the first bullet. Again, it was a large excavation project, and go to the next one. Operable Unit 3 was the big one. That was the production area. So there were 10 major production complexes, 4 gigantic treatment facilities, and 400 support structures. That took years and years to accomplish. This is Plant 7. It was actually a building that was only used for a couple of years, and they tried to do that via implosion. You've seen on TV before, like hotels that are being imploded, and it'll go boom, 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 and then it drops, collapses. That's not what happened at Fernald. Unfortunately, it dropped, and then it kind of went like that, and it stopped. So it was a very unsafe configuration for a little while until we could figure out how to bring it down. So that's actually the second implosion, and we did it at night. The first one was during the daytime, and we had a bunch of big wigs there, and an elected official got to push the fake button, and it was kind of embarrassing. Operable Unit 4 were the silos. There were 4 silos on site. One of them was never used, but silos 1 and 2 had uranium ore from the Belgian Congo, which was a huge source of radon on site. And so for those 2 silos, that was all stabilized, and we did truck shipments for that, and that also went to an off-site disposal facility. This whole infrastructure here was built in support of the silos project. So there's silos 1 and 2, and then there's 3 and 4 over here, kind of out of the picture. All of that other stuff was built specifically to support the silos remediation. This building here was just a clean warehouse. It stayed, and that is the current visitor center at the, we repurposed that building and spruced it up. This is just a photo inside of one of the silos because the removal of the waste inside was done robotically, and that's just a shot from inside. Operable Unit 4 was silo 3, and that was like a metal oxide waste, so it wasn't as nasty as the waste as in the silos 1 and 2. But again, those were truck shipments, 1 million mile shipping campaign. And so in 2002, there was a big celebration when the last truck left the Fernald site. Operable Unit 5, that is the groundwater and the soil. And we started out where it talks about remediating 196 contaminated acres of the Great Miami Aquifer. That was the estimated size of the uranium plume. And over the years, that plume has reduced in size because we've been pumping and treating. A small part of that plume was off-site and is still off-site, but it has shrunk considerably. We're cleaning that water to EPA safe drinking water standards. The soil and the sediment that was removed during remediation was placed in the on-site disposal facility. What you see in the lower right photo is some wells, monitoring wells or extraction wells being installed. So the cleanup headlines actually started to get a whole lot better than they were years and years ago. They started to be positive. This is the logo for the Fernald Preserve. So there's a kingfisher, is a bird that is very, you see it all the time, that the body of the bird is a leaf, which represents the forest that we have there. We have prairie grass, tall prairie grass, it's taller than me, and the water down at the bottom represents the wetlands and ponds that we have there at Fernald. So this was a photo taken just after cleanup, well, a few years after cleanup was completed, because it kind of started out as bare dirt, but it's all vegetated in. So there's the on-site disposal facility. Over here is the Great Miami River, and there's 8 cells to that on-site disposal facility. You come into the site, and right here is the groundwater, or the groundwater treatment facility, and then back here is the visitor center. Now you'll notice some of the ponds are kind of very weirdly shaped. They look like rectangles in some cases. That's because it's where buildings were. And depending on which building we were taking down, we would have to chase contamination. And so some of those water areas are quite deep and others are fairly shallow. There's a photo of the kingfisher. So on the left, it just gives you an idea of the acreage in the plant communities that we've got there. The OSDF itself is a 120-acre footprint of that. And in terms of what we're doing for long-term surveillance and maintenance at Fernald, we have what's called the Legacy Management and Institutional Controls Plan, and it documents everything that we need to do to take care of the site. We take a look at that every year and we modify it if it needs to be modified, and of course that's all done with the approval of the regulators, and we also put any proposed modifications out for public review and comment. In terms of aquifer restoration, we are cleaning it to EPA safe drinking water standards. Even though nobody's going to be drinking water produced at the Fernald site, what we are discharging to the river is discharged at drinking water standards. So we've got 20 extraction wells that provide almost 5,000 gallons per minute flow rate. Huge electricity bill at Fernald in order to do this. 48 billion gallons of groundwater have been extracted thus far. There is a reference there to the pounds of uranium thus far. That's really, it's dissolved uranium in water. It's not chunks of uranium. But our cleanup is based on a concentration based. It really is not a pounds removed. We will keep pumping until the groundwater meets safe drinking water levels. So we're pumping to meet a concentration. We've also got 140 monitoring wells that are out there. And the groundwater modeling is predicting that for the most contaminated part of the plume, which is on site, that will be done in the late 2030s. And you're not done until you do like a 3-year test. When we think we're done, we can monitor for another 3 years just to make sure that contaminants don't rebound. Like we'll shut the pumping wells off, but we'll keep monitoring. And only after we've proved after this 3-year period that, yep, drinking water has been, it's meeting drinking water standards, excuse me, then we would be able to demolish the wells, the water treatment system, and but right now, 2030s is what we're thinking. On-site disposal facility, 3 million cubic yards of waste in 8 cells. There's some stats on how big it is. It saved about $2 billion to have the waste placed in this on-site disposal facility versus shipping it off-site to somebody else's backyard. The infiltrating water, there is a leachate collection system. While the waste would be placed in the OSDF, if it rained, or when I told you about when we would spray water during demolition to control dust. So water was introduced into the OSDF, and then when you cap it, Over time, that waste is going to trickle through the waste, and that's what a leachate collection system does. It collects that, and that leachate water is treated to drinking water standards as well. That's the photo. Sorry, Penny. The one there on the bottom is where they have finished putting waste into the cell, and they're laying down a geosynthetic liner or two, and then dirt gets put on that and grass on top of that. This is our wastewater treatment facility. So that's designed to treat groundwater, even though we haven't had to treat groundwater in quite a while, but it's treating the leachate from the OSDF. The little greenhouses you see there are 8 of those. I mentioned the leachate collection system for the OSDF. For each cell, there's these valve houses that are collecting leachate, and then there's another layer called the leak detection system, which is below the liner, which we also monitor that, and they go into tanks inside these little valve houses, and then they are piped underground to the water treatment facility before they can be discharged to the river. The little blue houses then are valve houses for the 20 extraction wells. It's just a member of our sampling crew out collecting samples, and the lower right is an example of a monitoring well outside. The yellow things are bollards, just so like a vehicle doesn't drive over. Long-term surveillance and maintenance. Here are some photos of our ecological restoration work that we continue to do. So we have wetlands that we maintain. Here on the upper left, that was an erosion control project. On the upper right, we were literally planting wetland plugs, individual plants that we were jamming in the ground. On the lower photo, we have to do quarterly inspections of various areas of the site with the regulators, and that's just a photo of that. One of the things we do is maintaining the ecologically restored areas. We use controlled burns to manage the prairies, which is a great way. It's the way Mother Nature manages prairies, and that includes the grass that's on top of the OSDF, because you don't want woody vegetation growing on your OSDF. You want to be able to see that that cap is still in place, there's no slumping, there's no gopher holes, and burning it is a great way to do that. Lots of natural areas. It's a bird watcher's paradise. Penny's at the boardwalk, this photo here in the middle?
No.
That's just a general wetland photo. Right. Okay, so here we have some nice nature photos coming out. Monarch butterflies, we tag monarch butterflies. That's a weasel down there. Those are pileated woodpeckers. That happens to be a photo taken by a bird watcher that came to the site, and then we got their permission to use the photos. We have pretty good bobcat population. Now the kitten photo was not taken at Fernald, but the photo on the right, we have these trail cams all over the place, just like hunters use. Well, we have them all over the place too. And it captured this fellow here on the right and the left.
I will say that kitten wasn't taken at the site, but one of the groundwater monitoring crew personnel saw a kitten not too much bigger than that one a couple weeks ago. So it was born unusually late this year, but he said it was about this big. It was still real small.
This is kind of interesting. Those are American burying beetles, which are federally endangered species of beetle. Used to be here in Ohio. We have a partnership with the Cincinnati Zoo. In fact, if you go to the zoo in the insectarium, there's a very good display on how Fernald is helping with the reintroduction of that species to Ohio. It's kind of gross. The way it works is the zoo breeds males and females. They bring them to the site along with a bunch of dead rats. We go out and we drill these holes. You dump the rat in the hole, then you dump the male and the female in there, and you gently put some dirt on top, and then you go away and leave them alone. And then come back in maybe about 3 weeks or so, I think. The zoo will come back and pull the dirt out very carefully, and what they're hoping to find are larvae of the beetles. We also, I believe this was the first year, and you correct me if I'm wrong, where we found evidence of beetles actually overwintering. So the zoo was ecstatic. Like, they would find evidence in previous years that the beetles were reproducing, but they never found evidence that the beetles were able to overwinter to the next season to breed again. So this was a really big deal with the zoo.
So it sounds gross, but we're all glad something eats dead things, right? Yeah.
We have an array of public activities. Again, this is something that Penny and her staff do at the visitor center. Not only do they have programs that are tailored to specific groups that want to come, like a local garden club, they might want to come and have a very specific program. But there's also programs that are open to the general public, including activities that happen at night, like for coyotes, fireflies, frogs, owls. Lower left, we have a bunch of birders that come to the site, and I've learned with those folks, you just you leave them alone. The last thing they want is you rolling down your window, and, hey, what you doing? You just leave them alone. We monitor some of the social media sites that the birding groups use, and there are some just gorgeous photos that we get from these folks with their permission. And we have used them in some of our publications, those photos. We've got a little over 7 miles of hiking trails, and so they go through either forest, wetlands, or a prairie grass. We do have one section of trail that's paved. It's by a little overlook, because we knew that for some people, maybe if you have a cane or a wheelchair, it's pretty hard to be on some of those trails that are just dirt or crushed gravel. And that's a photo of our visitor center at night. Remember, that was a warehouse from the Silos project, basically a Butler building. Inside on the left, that's one of our 2 reservable spaces. That happens to be the Fernald Community Alliance, which is the current citizens group that comes and meets there every 6 weeks. They're still keeping an eye on stuff at Fernald. They attend our public meetings. They help clean up the environment on the periphery of the site. And that photo there on the right is just one of the entrance to the exhibit areas. This is the visitor center in the back, and then there's a big parking lot that sidewalk is coming to. So there are reservable space for use by nonprofits, a gigantic meeting room that can hold like 300 people, and then that small resource room that I just showed you. The exhibit hall, they are static exhibits, and they are on these themes. The history that goes back, that includes the Native American days, and then the settlers that came in, and the farming, and the land that was taken by eminent domain, all the way through production cleanup, and the very large-scale environmental and ecological restoration through today's legacy management mission. And as I said, there's a broad range of environmental programs that are offered. Just 2 weeks ago, we won a very prestigious award at Fernald. We applied for the US EPA's National Federal Facility Excellence in Site Reuse Award. For this, it was for the category of NPL sites. And Fernald won first place across the United States, and we had bigwigs from EPA headquarters came to present this award to us a couple weeks ago. So moving forward, we need to keep that extraction well field operating 24/7. That's the 20 extraction wells. All the maintenance that is associated with operating what's called the Converted Advanced Wastewater Treatment Facility. And as I mentioned, once the groundwater meets the final remediation levels for various contaminants, such as uranium, and those cleanup levels are Safe Drinking Water Act levels, we will do that 3-year certification process to prove that the contaminants are not called rebounding. And once we've proven that that is not going to occur, we can tear all of that infrastructure down, and then we also make sure the soil that all that infrastructure was sitting on is also clean to appropriate standards. And we will continue to monitor and maintain that on-site disposal facility. We also need to continue managing some of the prairie communities through controlled burns. That includes on the OSDF cap. Monitoring and maintaining some of those areas. For example, we go out and we'll monitor amphibian populations. We are also ensuring all the site amenities and interpret services are maintained and refreshed. The visitor center, the hiking trails, they're inspected once a week to make sure there's no slips, trips, falls, hazards. Fencing gets damaged, signs get damaged, those sorts of things. And a huge part of the mission is that last one, ensuring future generations remember what the Fernald site history was, and that it also remains a community asset as an undeveloped park, with an emphasis on wildlife. So, summary, they were both cleaned up to EPA standards under the CERCLA process. Ohio EPA and US EPA continue to oversee work that the Department of Energy performs at the site. Local communities are very much involved in cleanup decisions. Both sites, of course, are protected with human health and the environment. Great examples of beneficial reuse, and they're both considered assets to the communities. So, again, I want to thank Penny Boardman for assisting me today, and Bill Hurd also, who is the site lead with Mineral Research and Engineering at Fernald, who's been there for over 30 years. So, that concludes my presentation. Are there any questions?